I should mention first up, just so everyone's aware, slight change of format this year in terms of the ExCo dialogue. As you will be aware, I think we communicated in November last year in Luxembourg, we approved changes to our ExCo composition, and we became an even more inclusive family in the Executive Committee with additional members. The one downside of that is we can no longer fit everyone on one stage. So as a result, what you see here are members of our ExCo leadership, so chairs of committees, including our executive committee. I will make one special announcement, hot off the press. I'm very happy to announce that at yesterday's executive committee, let me preface the happy part with the sad part. We said a sad farewell to Julie Mix-McPeak. As you know, Commissioner McPeak or as you may know, Commissioner McPeak is leaving the supervisory authority in Tennessee. And yesterday was sadly her last meeting. But I am very happy to announce that we seamlessly approved a new vice chair of the executive committee, who is to my immediate left, David Altmaier from USA, Florida. So actually a round of welcome for David. It's great to have you with us. And in terms of the rest of the panel, we have the chair of our macroprudential committee, Alberto, chair of our PDC, Elise, chair of our implementation and assessment committee, Peter Braumüller. We have Jeff Summerhays, who's our sustainability champion on ExCo. You already know Hiroshi. Suzette Fulchelsang, who is our third vice chair of ExCo, and some members of our ICS task force as well. So happy to have Mike Considine and Frederic from our ICS task force. And I think I have covered everyone. So that's the introductions. To share with you the structure of the dialogue. So the first part, we've structured it into three parts. The first segment will be a dialogue on what we've called our emerging and emerged risks. So really it's the new horizon that Vicky talked about in terms of our strategic plan that she covered this morning. And then like previous years, there's no panel of stakeholders to ask questions. We will have an open mic, and I will invite questions from the audience. Once we've completed that segment, we'll move on to the second one, which is dealing with implementation issues. And then finally, we will conclude with a segment dealing with standard setting and financial stability topics. Right, so obviously we would like as much stakeholder interaction as possible, so I probably talked enough already. Just to say, I will be the moderator and managing, calling upon people to ask questions. Vicky will be our chair for the ExCo dialogue, and will manage the group here in terms of recognizing ExCo members to perhaps respond to specific questions. So with that, maybe over to you, Vicky, for some brief remarks.
I think people just want to get on with it. So hello, everybody. I hope this works. So Jonathan, I invite you to basically start with the first set of questions. Just to say, because a number of you I see every year, this is the 5th consecutive year we have held the global seminar, and we have tried every year to improve the interaction. I mean, this format hopefully will be as interactive as possible. We would appreciate comments on how we can improve it. And again, apologies, we could not have the entirety of our new ExCo body here. But as some, I can see some of our ExCo members in the front row, and of course they will be engaged in also inputting to this. But thank you for coming. Let's get into it.
Great, excellent. So let's kick off then with a dialogue on emerging risks and opportunities. I'm not going to give a big intro because Vicky and Ricardo had a good conversation this morning on the new horizon, the new direction, including climate risk, cyber risk, fintech, sustainable development, and other areas, conduct and culture. But we are keen to receive input and thoughts from stakeholders as we embark on this new strategic plan. So let's jump straight into it. And I would like maybe first to call on Jafia. Olaf, are you in the audience?
I think well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to interact in this way. I think from a JIFIA point of view, we welcome the feedback you gave on the new strategy, and I think in particular the commitment to continue the engagement. And I think one of the things I would point out, particularly in terms of the ICS, what you mentioned earlier on about the that you're going to clarify that it is the monitoring period is a period for monitoring the effectiveness of the ICS and whether it's working, and is not a monitoring period of the actual solvency is important. I think also you mentioned about that it's not for use for third parties, and I think you mentioned it's not for reliance on third parties, but I think one of the things we add is that I think it should not be for use by third parties as well. And I think in terms of one other element of the monitoring period, you mentioned that you'll continue the engagement with the stakeholders during that period as you have in the past. And I think that's always also an important point, because I think that the ICS 2.0 is not going to be completed at this stage and therefore will require further work and development.
So thanks, Olaf. I'm going to have to intervene there in terms of the structure of the session. Thanks for the question. I think we're going to park it. Because just in terms of the structure of the session, we're going to focus on the emerging risks first, issues like cyber, financial inclusion, etc. So as not to make sure we have an even distribution of the topics. So perhaps if you have one on that area, this is a good time. Otherwise, we'll keep that question for later.
Well, I think on the emerging risks, I think that we welcome the fact that you're looking at these other issues as well. I think that one thing we'll stress, as we have done in the past, that your approach always has to be proportionate, and I think that obviously drawing on the work that's going on within the local markets rather than trying to rebuild something that already has been developed, particularly on cyber and sustainability and other emerging areas. There is a lot of work going on, but certainly you can benefit from looking at best practices, but always with proportionality very high in mind. And in that respect, in terms of questions, we often making sure proportionality is turned from a good concept into something real. One question I would have is, how are you going to make sure that in your emerging work, as in other work, you're going to ensure that proportionality is more than a concept?
Yes, thank you, Olaf. Perhaps we can. I can turn to Jeff first, because you mentioned kind of climate and sustainability. I mean, your particular focus was on proportionality, but perhaps Jeff can talk about our approach, including on proportionality on sustainability, and then I'm going to ask Hero the similar question on cyber, to just give you a perspective on real examples.
Thanks, Vicky, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the question. I think it's a fair comment about proportionality and how we learn. Regulators globally in all sectors have come a huge way in only a few years on the sustainability issues, if I can comment on that. I think there's been a dramatic paradigm shift in terms of regulators' engagement, knowledge, and work on this. And so we certainly don't hold ourselves out as a standard-setting body as being experts, but we are learning and learning quickly, and we are doing that by engaging with industry, engaging with cross-sectoral bodies, academia, industry groups, think tanks, scientific bodies, and alike. And certainly from the IAS's point of view, we were the first global standard-setting body to release at this event last year an issues paper on climate risk and its impact on the insurance sector. And really, when we were releasing that paper, we're doing that to engage with our supervisors and members and the industry more broadly on the risk as an awareness-building phase. We are now shifting slightly to do some more work on disclosure, which is, I think, a big issue and a big concern for the sector as a whole. This is a very complex risk. It's a very difficult risk to model. It's a very difficult risk to understand its interdependencies, and to make good decisions as an insurer, as a regulator, indeed as governments globally, we need better information than we have got at the moment. So from the association's point of view, happy to update you that we are currently working on a second issues paper which is around disclosure, and we have just completed a survey of 1,200 insurers globally through 15 of our members, a representative sort of body across continents and jurisdictions. And there's a panel session tomorrow morning where I'll be talking to some of the details on that. But I certainly take on board your comments around proportionality and assure you that from a standard-setting perspective and a capability and capacity-building perspective, we are engaging as widely as we can to increase our knowledge and try and apply that knowledge with our members and the sectors and industries that we regulate.
Thank you very much. I think with regards to the cyber resilience, my friend David will make some comment later on, but I just want to make a quick comments on fintech aspects. I think it's still much early right now to develop standards or requirements at international level on those emerging issues like fintech, because those issues are rapidly evolving, and we supervisors are not yet even in a position to clearly identify the extent of risks. And of course, we are working closely together under the umbrella of IAIS to share our concerns, to learn from experiences from others. But we are not yet there to develop a standards or requirement. Having said that, as our 2020-2024 strategic plan will indicate, the fintech and cyber resilience and climate risks are areas of common interest with other standard-setting bodies, and we are committed to look for opportunities for coordination and collaboration with those standard-setting bodies and stakeholders that reflect our respective roles. So, for example, the IAIS will organize a joint workshop with the FSB, Financial Innovation Network, later this year, and we expect that we can discuss and exchange views with other financial authorities on the opportunities and risks of the use of new sources of data or consumer data protection and third-party outsourcing issues. I stop here.
Thanks, Hiro. I mean, the general message, I guess, Olaf, that you're hearing from colleagues here with regards to proportionality and the emerging and evolving risks is that our approach to them is not to jump to standards, because once you have standards, obviously you need to sort of calibrate the intensity of application, and then the whole issue of proportionality comes to play. Our approach is to support our members by understanding what is best practice within that, and to understand the risks better rather than immediately jump to standard setting. But as Hiro also says, given that some of these risks apply across the financial system, it is quite important that we coordinate, and it's important from the perspective of the industry that we coordinate with other standard setters, because the worst thing is if you get multiple different responses from different sectoral regulators for exactly the same risk. So in this way, we're trying, if you want to be proportionate and not overburdensome in the way that we're approaching these emerging and emerged risks. But when it comes to setting standards in this area, we're not yet at all at this stage. Clearly, at that stage, we will try to set strong standards, and we will also then, at that stage, take into account proportionality to the extent that it's relevant.
Vicky, can I just add on that point? In our first issues paper on climate risk, we identified how our existing ICPs would factor in, or should climate risk could be seen through the lens of the existing ICPs. So, you know, if you go to issues around governance, around risk management, around investment, insurance risk, etc., I don't think we're proposing that there is a new policy around this risk. We just would ask that the risk be considered through the lens of our existing ICPs and factored into firms' assessment.
Also, I'd like to invite David to give his perspective as well on cyber and any other emerged risk.
Thank you, Vicky. And it really is, just as you've said, with respect to the other emerging risks, with respect specifically to cyber risks. You know, our membership has certainly signaled recently that cybersecurity and operational resiliency are top priorities of the organization. And we've seen recently cyber risks growing, both in their prevalence and in their disruptive potential. And as you've said, we've conducted member surveys that have revealed that the maturity of jurisdictional, regulatory, and supervisory regimes for cybersecurity varies pretty widely among IAIS members. And so, as you mentioned, collaborating across other financial supervisors to provide consistent cross-sectoral guidance for financial institutions, cybersecurity is going to be a big part of our process going forward. And to that end, in late 2018, our executive committee approved the formation of a small group on cyber underwriting with the mandate to review possible obstacles to sustainable cyber underwriting practices. And this group is going to be conducting many of the same things that you've just outlined, which is exploring the information we currently have to assess what's happening across our jurisdictions and determining the role of insurance supervisors in this risk going forward. So I think we're looking forward to engaging with our colleagues around the insurance community as well as the larger financial community and engaging with our stakeholders to determine an appropriate pathway forward.
Great, thank you for those replies. And then let's see if we have any other questions from the audience, either on cyber, climate risk, fintech, any of those issues?
Tony with AIG. I had a question. You know, earlier today it was mentioned that as part of this pivot to these new and emerging risks, there would also be a pivot to kind of taking a more collaborative approach with stakeholders. And I'm just wondering in practice what that might look like, whether there's been any discussions about kind of concrete steps that could be taken to actually see that through and what that might look like. You know, for example, cyber-related, operational resilience, I think there's probably areas there of collaboration, but at the same time, if you look across this financial sector, regulators in the banking sector who are looking at this, and also I haven't seen any sense that they're looking at it quite the way you're suggesting in terms of collaboration. And I think there's also room possibly in the climate change space. I mean, companies are looking at developing scenario analyses to assess the impact of a 2-degree change of temperature on their assets and liabilities. And I'm sure there's welcome collaboration with regulators on that front as well, but I'm just wondering, are there any concrete examples you can give? Thanks.
Thank you. So at the generic level, we've been discussing how actually to implement this collaborative new model. For example, just to give you an example, in the area of fintech, last year in the autumn, the executive committee, through the initiative of an insurance group, met with a number of developers in Silicon Valley of these applications that were looking at and asking questions about the regulatory landscape for these digital applications to become commercial. That's an example of how we actually do it. Executive committee also meets at least once a year with CEOs of a number of insurance companies to get their perspective about their major risks. We have decided that we also want the perspective not only of the companies, but also of the people who lend or invest on insurance companies or rate them. So we are also going to hold conversations with investors and rating agencies as well. Another example is Diane from MetLife earlier today asked Alberto I don't want to talk about the substance of the holistic framework, but asked about the possibility of qualitative inputs, not only from supervisors and through the data, but also through kind of CROs as well. And we are actively considering to build that into the process of having a forward-looking engagement. These are some examples of how we are thinking about implementing this collaborative model, but there will be others as well. But before, you asked about climate risk and sustainability. I want to hand over to Jeff to see what he thinks about engaging stakeholders in that work.
So with climate risk, we use a slightly different model in that the association partners with the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which is made up of about 25 of our members, again with a broad representation. And that group has been very active in developing content and engagement across cross-sectoral interests as it relates to climate. I mentioned the second issues paper, which we are currently working on, and the survey that we sent out, and we had 1,200 firms respond to that survey, and again, we'll be talking in a little more detail on the panel session tomorrow on that. But we will be engaging with industry in the third quarter of this year. We're yet to finalise the date, but likely to be in September, where we want to play back some of the preliminary findings we've found in that survey, and there's some issues in there which on first brush are a little troubling in that the vast majority of firms acknowledge that climate is a material risk to their business, both on liabilities and asset side, but a much smaller percentage of firms are disclosing that, and even a smaller amount are planning to do any scenario testing. So we're seeking to understand that with industry engagement in September, as I said, likely. But to the earlier point on proportionality, I think it'd be fair to say that the larger, more sophisticated firms are very advanced, but there is quite a long tail of firms where they are less advanced. We're seeking to sort of understand that, and then from an association and work out how we can both improve the capacity and capability of our members to supervise that, and in turn support firms in their development of, as I said, a complex and rapidly emerging risk.
Thank you. Maybe I can just add a few perspectives from the Secretariat side and the organisation of our work. I think what we've set out in the strategic plan, and certainly in our discussions around operationalising the strategic plan, is recognising that on many of these new themes, these are areas where we're still exploring, and we would like to do that in collaboration with those who are equally grappling with some of these topics. And examples of that include thinking about how we can obtain stakeholder input at an earlier stage of our own thinking. So, for example, looking at organising roundtables. So one example would be, for instance, David mentioned the work on supervisors' role in sustainable cyber underwriting. We have in our plan, that group is being set up, but in our plan, at an early stage, there would be that engagement with stakeholders who have spent, we know, a number of associations and organisations that have spent a good deal of time thinking about these issues. So we want to make sure we get those perspectives. Another example is we are collaborating with the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, in October this year, we'll be holding jointly with the FSB Financial Innovation Network a roundtable on the use of alternative data and advanced data analytics, where we will have industry stakeholders involved as well. So that's one clear example of roundtables and input at an early stage. Secondly, at a secretariat level, we are also spending some time with industry associations and organizations to start sharing our respective work plans at a fairly early stage, and if possible, looking at around coordination and collaboration so that our respective areas of work can perhaps build on each other and learn from each other. So that will be another focus going forward as well. Okay, I see Bernie in the audience, and this would be good time to hear from you.
Wonderful, thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bernie Birnbaum. I'm with the Center for Economic Justice, which is a consumer organization based in the United States. We've been very active at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners in front of individual states, and I'm also a member of the Federal Advisory Committee on Insurance. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to participate, and also wanted to thank you for developing this genuine and unscripted conversation. It's refreshing and appreciated. Thank you. The issue that I wanted to raise are the challenges and opportunities from insurers' use of big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the Internet of Things. These technologies have potential to transform the relationship between consumers and insurers, to bring incredible benefits to consumers for risk mitigation and security. But there are also risks, not just potential risks, but actual current risks associated with these technologies. The flip side of personalization is exclusion. How do we ensure that algorithms do not reflect and perpetuate historic discrimination against protected classes? How do we ensure that insurers employ ethical procedures for the development and deployment of data sources and algorithms? A number of jurisdictions have established or are establishing principles and guidelines for ethical algorithms. Is such an effort part of the strategic plan for the IAIS? How do we ensure that consumer voices are part of that discussion? You've mentioned several times your engagement with industry stakeholders. We have not heard your similar engagement with consumer stakeholders. If a vote of priorities among stakeholders in this room is held, there obviously will be overwhelming bias towards industry priorities. If you held the same vote with a room of 200 consumer stakeholders and 2 industry stakeholders, you would get different perspectives. So the question is more than just what specific activities are included in your strategic plan to ensure ethical and fair use of big data and emerging digital technologies, but how does the IAIS ensure that that strategy reflects consumer voices as well as those of the industry? Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Hiro?
Yep. Thank you very much, Bernie, for your question. I think it's, this question relates to our policy of the stakeholder engagement. I think the new trends and developments like fintech or cyber risk or sustainability, those kind of things bring with them, you say, new stakeholder landscape. And in case of fintech, it could range from fintech startups or data privacy and telecommunications regulators. So I think as the IAIS, we can, for example, continue to expand the participation of new stakeholders in our milestone events like this one, or we can organize an additional subject matter-specific workshops, or we can also examine our external representation, or we can evaluate the need to further extension, or we can encourage committee and subcommittee chairs to invite guests into their discussions. So those are the things that we as an IAIS can do. And also with regards to fintech, we have established last year a virtual group of supervisors who has an expertise in technologies. And this virtual group called FinTech Forum is chaired by our FinTech champion, Henshin Ho, from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And this FinTech Forum has already had several or many virtual meetings, and some of them they invited the experts in the fintech world. So already, the interaction between the IAIS and the fintech experts are starting, and in this context, we would like to further expand our stakeholder engagement.
Just to say, Bunny, I'm going to ask Jonathan to tell you about expanding our consumer representatives in stakeholder engagement. I did mention it actually this morning, but briefly. We are acutely aware that a number of the new issues are particularly relevant to the consumer, as you are actually just set out with artificial intelligence and with machine learning. And therefore, it is particularly important to expand consumer engagement. Now, this is the objective. We've got to deliver it, and but it's certainly an objective that the Executive Committee has embraced, given the emerging risks that you have just identified. So, Jonathan.
So very briefly, absolutely, I can tell you this is certainly an area we're going to be doing work. In fact, our market conduct working group has already been doing work on the use of personal data, also looking at ethical use of big data and algorithms and what that means for conduct supervision. As Hiro mentioned, this has been flagged as an issue there where we need to do more work by our FinTech Forum, so we will be taking that forward. What I will say is that probably, we don't know for sure yet, but I would say it would be reasonably likely that we would do that work in collaboration again, because these are not issues that only impact the insurance sector, of course. They are very much cross financial sector issues. So, for instance, we had a meeting, a high-level meeting of standard-setting bodies just a couple of weeks back, where the very topic was around alternative data, advanced data analytics, ethical use of algorithms, and a prompt for supervisors, standard-setting bodies to work collectively on these topics together with the FSB. There's been some interesting work. We had a colleague from Singapore who shared the sort of proposed framework for the ethical use of data and algorithms that they've developed there as a model for perhaps other supervisors to look at. So there is work going on. But to your particular question around stakeholder engagement and with consumer representatives in particular, I'm happy to say that yesterday at our executive committee we had a session specifically on stakeholder engagement, where we took forward some proposals recognizing that our new strategic plan, this new landscape, will have implications for the type of issues that we need to look at and the type of stakeholders that we need to engage with. That includes technology providers, but I'm happy, I can confirm that specifically we also highlighted that because, as Vicky says, because these issues are so relevant to the consumer, this does imply a need for a more active process of engagement with consumer groups as well. And so what was supported by the executive committee is that we will be looking to develop specific engagement opportunities with consumer groups. Okay, do I have another question on this in this area? Thanks.
Hello, Jay Bruns from the Washington State Insurance Commissioner's Office. And I was struck this morning by a comment that Vicky made, and I would very much like to hear you expound on it a little bit more, and that had to do with climate change and insurance companies. And you pointed out that one big way that insurers could contribute to solving that issue is through investments. I agree, it really struck a chord with me, because beyond transparency and disclosure, which Jeff Summerhayes just spoke to, I think insurance regulators and insurance companies that I've spoken to all agree that they would love to figure out a way to invest more to put us on a course to a low carbon economy. The problem, of course, is in the details, and there is no standard yet for evaluating insurance portfolios and figuring out how they can be green or greener. And I'm wondering if you have given any, had any discussions on that trajectory.
Yes, we have had some discussions. I'm wondering, Jeff, do you want to take that, and I can elaborate?
Sure. So, I mean, insurers have, Jay, as you would know too well, I mean, insurers have been underwriting climate risk for decades, centuries, perhaps, and are very good at that. What is challenging about this risk is that the past is no longer a good predictor of the future and the confluence of events. So that is on the physical risk side, but I think what you're referring to are the impacts of transition risks as the world moves to a low carbon economy and how that plays out in terms of change in markets and pricings and values of assets. And in part, that is at the core of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework, which predominantly has an investor lens to it. And of course, insurers are not only risk transfer mechanisms, facilities, but they are also investors and they are sources of information. And I think the insurance sector is doing a lot of work on understanding that, particularly the larger, more sophisticated firms, and in some jurisdictions, the regulators have been quite prescriptive about holdings of firms in higher carbon-intensive assets. So for our part, from the IAIS, we are again, trying to build capacity and understanding within our members through the issues papers, the one that we have published and the one that we're currently working on, which in part go to some of these issues to better inform supervisors to supervise these risks that sit within firms. But the movement on investments is not just coming from supervisors, it's coming from investors, large global investors, community action groups, and alike. So there is a weight of money which is pushing towards changing portfolios to be more sustainable. And there's a fair body of evidence from rating agencies and others to suggest that a sustainable future is also highly aligned to a financially sustainable future as well. So there is a lot of published material on this, as I'm sure you're familiar with. But for our part, from the IAS point of view, we repeat our objective at this phase is to help build capacity and understanding within our members so that these risks can be appropriately supervised.
Thank you, Jeff. And if I could add to that, I mean, there are, as Jeff said, there are transition risks to our firms, to the extent, to the firms that we supervise, to your firms, to the extent that there isn't a smooth transition to more sustainable infrastructure investment because of the possibility of both technological and political sudden moves that might lead to, essentially substantial drops in market values and stranded assets on the portfolio side. So as Jeff says, we need to have an understanding of how to manage these transition risks. But also, there is emerging data and evidence that could suggest that the risks associated currently with certain sustainable infrastructure investments, other factors being equal, might be lower than other risks. Now, for example, there was a study that was done by one of our members, the World Bank, published last year using S&P data on these issues, public data on exposures. So what we would like, and indeed we would like to use, I don't want to discuss the ICS yet because we are an emerging risk, but as part of the monitoring period and the work we are doing on the ICS, I'm glad to report that we also discussed a work plan on how, indeed yesterday and the day before yesterday, on how we can assess whether certain types of infrastructure investment merit a lower prudential charge as we go forward. This is not an easy topic because, as you know, and a number of you know, is the definition of what is a sustainable infrastructure activity is very, very difficult. And we need the data sources to do it. But I think it is our role as regulators to look at it very, very carefully. And there are a number of jurisdictions across the world that they are looking at it, and they're looking at definitions of activities, for instance. And there are data collection exercises, and Elise can elaborate, but we're developing a work plan so that we can look at these issues over the horizon as well. I don't know whether Elise wants to elaborate on that.
Sure, I'll just add just very briefly to that. So as Vicky outlined, this is an area that we will be looking at, and first step will be sort of a stock taking, looking at existing data that's out there that we may be able to take account of. We have said at the PDC that any determination that we would make for a differentiated capital treatment would have to be evidence-based. And so, as I said, the first step is more of a stock taking. And then once we have that and see what the data tells us, we'll make a determination about how to move forward during the monitoring period.
Thank you. So let's have one last question in this segment from Dennis Nurtuk. I know had a question on financial inclusion. Dennis, are you in the room?
Thank you, Jonathan. I've got a question on regulation in relation to reducing protection gaps and promoting financial inclusion. So in emerging markets in particular, it is important to seek to reduce protection gaps and to promote financial inclusion. We had the Progress seminar at the Geneva Association earlier this year, and this issue was discussed on one of the panels. And I think it's fair to say that our panel concluded that in certain circumstances, some kinds of regulation light might underpin the expansion of insurance and in that way spur economic growth. Would you agree to this? And can you give practical examples of how regulation light could work?
Thank you very much for the question. Suzette, the Vice Chair, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. So yes, I fully agree that a light regulatory framework can support financial inclusion, and if I may support that by example, in particularly using example from the jurisdiction I am from, we've introduced a microinsurance regulatory framework last year. So that is a framework where it lowers the barrier for entry. So there's lower capital requirements, but that's supplemented by rules more than principles. So there's clear investment rules to limit additional risk on the balance sheet. And it's also complemented by market conduct requirements like the term of the policy and the sum assured involved in those type of products. So by providing that regulatory space, we actually licensed our first microinsurer a few months ago, but we've seen a lot of interest, and it offers products to those that's excluded by the normal commercial markets. And I know a lot of jurisdictions on the continent from where I'm from also is developing or has developed microinsurance, which is a light regulatory framework. But the main aim still remains the protection of policyholders. Another example that we're currently working on is around allowing a limited, restricted, or a light license to allow for pilot projects so that we can allow institutions to come into the market and test some of the products. One we're working on is an index insurance product, and it's sort of a fintech type of structure. But it's important that the regulatory framework and the standards developed and used is agile enough to cater for these type of innovations or offerings to close the risk protection gaps we've got in particularly the emerging markets that we're from.
Great, thank you, Suzette. And what I can flag is in our strategic plan, issues of financial inclusion and closing the protection gap remain a priority. I think you all know that the IIS has a long track record of working on financial inclusion issues, so we will continue to work on guidance on application of proportionality in support of inclusive insurance markets. We better move on to the next segment, which is relates to our work on implementation. Again, this has been an area, a priority of ours for some time, recognizing, developing standards is half the work. It's also helping our members to implement those standards and assessing how they have implemented those standards. We've done a lot of work on that around the ICPs, but going forward, we'll also be looking at robust implementation assessment of our holistic framework, as well as ComFrame over time, which will tend to be a more intensive approach to drive global consistency in the implementation of these measures. So I know we had a pre-submitted question from Robert Neal from ACLI, so I'd like to call upon Robert.
Yes, good afternoon. Robert Neal with the American Council of Life Insurers. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And if I could, before I dive into the implementation, was hoping to make a comment on your previous section on emerging risks. ACLI has been actively engaged with the Global Federation of Insurance Associations, including associations from around the globe, Europe, North America, Japan, Asia, so all the major jurisdictions, on a coalition on reinsurance education that is working on background materials on concerns with forced localization of reinsurance. And I know we've flagged this for you, and Jonathan, we sent you documentation on this yesterday, so you haven't had a chance to digest it or share it with the executive committee, but we hope you'll be able to do so. We look forward to speaking to you further about it, perhaps in Abu Dhabi, if not before. And so appreciate this opportunity. I know you're all tired after a long week. But in terms of the implementation issues, I simply wanted to, and as Vicky referenced this morning in the discussion with Rick Redo, that one of your key priorities in the new strategic plan is to pivot to implementation, and simply wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit on the implications and what that means for stakeholders in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. May I turn to Peter Brownmiller, who is the chair of the Implementation Assessment Committee on this question. And by the way, Robert, I should say thank you for the paper. As you sent yesterday evening, it is an issue that you have been raising for some time. I haven't been able to digest the paper, but I can promise you that I will look at it very, very carefully. Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Try to, in brief words, to explain that. I expected our new strategic plan being uploaded by the end of today. That's what I assume, for all of you to digest. But let me go into that. What Vicky said was that we not only reduced the number of our high-level goals, but we also put them in a graph to show how they depend on each other and how they are interlinked. And there is this first one, which is the assessing of developments and responding to developments. We've quite heard just a few minutes ago on what that means. So we're looking into what is going on in the markets, both from economic developments, technological developments, and things like that. And then it shows that that not necessarily now means, and we have also heard that, standard setting responses. So it might also go directly to support supervisors, to supervisory practices. So sometimes the standards are clear, but there is not, might be an application paper missing, or there is a guidance missing below the standards, or things like that. So I think that would also help us to understand when we say we want to make our set of standards more stable in the future, that not every event that we identify in the market automatically leads to a new standard and a standard setting process. It can, but not necessarily. Some of them can, and it is so also directly impact supervisory practices, and that is then part of our implementation activities. And then finally, both standard setting and the, how supervisory practice are applied in the markets then need to be monitored, and that leads us to the high-level goal 4, which is the observance of standards, to look into monitor the observance of standards. So there is also a feedback, of course, from this work on the observance of standards, on saying if standards are not observed, what is the reason for that? Is that lack of transposition into legislation in a jurisdiction? Is this a problem of practical implementation or application of the standard? Or is it a problem of the standard itself? Might be that it's no longer really targeting what it should target it in a changing world. So there are these two elements of the strengthening the supervisory practices, supporting supervisors by sharing good supervisory practices and facilitating the understanding of supervisory issues, this high-level goal 3, as you will then see in our strategic plan. This comprises things like develop high-quality supporting materials. So supporting material for us is application papers and issues papers. To facilitate the sharing of experience and practices, we have our supervisory forum, where experienced frontline supervisors from different jurisdictions exchange their practical experience with what we are doing, and the feedback is highly relevant to us. Building partnership with other bodies, and of course also strengthen supervisory cooperation. I can say that now we have already 70 signatories to the MMOU. We have many more applications, and this will also be crucial for, as you know, that the collaboration in the colleges will be more important under the COM frame. So this is also very relevant to that. And then the so-called assessment of implementation, the observance of the assessment, the so-called high-level goal 4. So we want to assess and also promote the observance of all our supervisory material, which includes principle standards and guidance. For that purpose, we developed now a system of assessment that comprises mainly 3 elements, which is the self-assessment program, a well-known program, but there we are going to provide a tool for supervisors so they can more easily do that and more regularly do that, because that's the starting point for all of the other ones, even for the third-party assessments. Then the peer review processes, which turned out to be the thematic ones, which turned out to be quite successful. So we try to cover over a few years, more or less, the whole set of standards and principles in combining those from a thematic perspective. And we have started the member assessment program because we believe that is also a necessary element, knowing very well that this is a big effort, a very big effort, but we believe it's worthwhile. And here we are in an early stage. We have now our first pilot. We're going to do that. The second element that fits in there is the facilitation of supervisory capacity building. And the most recent example is our common approach with the International Actuarial Association and the A2I to do something on supervisory capacity building, which, by the way, was identified from assessments that we had before, that the lack of actuarial capacity for supervisors, particularly in emerging markets, triggered a high level of non-observance of standards just because of this one situation. So if we can remedy that, that might further strengthen the observance of standards in that respect. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor on where we want to move. I've certainly open, after you have the chance to read that, to get again in dialogue and see. We believe that, of course, the other ones is still in preparatory phase, I would say, if we talk about holistic framework and about ComFrame, because the starting point for our assessment work, and particularly assessment of standards, is, of course, that the supervisory material has been approved and finalized. But, of course, together with Alberto and Elise, we try also to do our best to prepare, to help to prepare for the implementation of both ComFrame and the holistic framework at an earlier stage, so that we can then also enter with our assessment activities after the material has been approved, to see how it's applied in practice. I stop here for the moment, and if there are further questions, we can, of course, come back.
Just to say on this, we had a number of discussions around how we're going to do the implementation assessment of ComFrame, and we're still sort of continuing with these discussions. This is implementation is not only, assessment is not only important because it provides value to each of our individual members, it is also extremely important to ensure consistency of approach amongst our members, and therefore a level playing field when consistency makes sense, because of course proportionality needs to be taken into account. And I just want to highlight as a message, some of you were in the room in the previous panel, the conversation chaired by Alberto, and you had a member of the FSP Secretariat who covers the insurance sector issues, amongst other issues, Simonetta. And she made the point that with respect to the holistic framework in particular, and that means all elements of the framework, the FSB would like to first see how we have implemented, we the supervisors have implemented it in practice before they actually transition finally away from the GSII list to the holistic framework. So we are very actively currently discussing the implementation assessment methodology and other elements of how we can do that. And it's quite clear why the FSB are interested in this, and we agree as well as members. They're interested in this because, as Simonetta said, this is an ambitious framework, and it relies a lot on supervisory willingness and cooperation to implement it, but also in order to ensure consistency and a degree of level playing field. So that is an area where our implementation assessment activities are not the normal set of activities that we used to do, are changing, and they're becoming kind of key, as well as the areas that Peter said, a key part of our kind of vision on some of the key post-crisis portfolios. Thank you.
Great. So first of all, a live update to confirm our new strategic plan is on our website now. So if you want, you can even take out your phone and have a look. But secondly, in the interest of time, thank you for the question on implementation. But I think but so we don't run out of time, we better move on to part C of the dialogue, which is on our standard setting and financial stability work, which of course covers ComFrame, ICS and holistic framework. We heard a lot about that already today, so no introductory remarks necessary. And let me immediately, I'm calling upon people who pre-submitted questions, so let me immediately call on Mary Francis from the IIF, if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in the ExCo dialogue. In terms of looking at financial stability and standard setting, I have 3 thoughts that I'd like to share with the ExCo and get their reaction to it. And one is looking at these issues, and especially in the context of emerging risks. There is a need to look across markets and across sectors, as you've acknowledged very, very clearly, and we appreciate that. But there's also a need to look at non-traditional market participants who may be conducting similar activities. So one part of the question is how the IAIS intends to look at those non-traditional market participants. A second has to do with some of the comments that were made regarding market fragmentation. This is an area that the IIF is keenly interested in and keenly involved in through efforts at the standard setters, including the FSB. But I think in the insurance context, there's a need to balance the very legitimate concerns about market fragmentation with an acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of the insurance market, which is very, very different from the banking market, and just how that can be properly balanced. And then third, when we get into the area of looking at financial stability and standard setting in the context of new and emerging risks, we're all trying to get our heads around some of the challenges and opportunities and some of the risks in a very rapidly changing environment. And so I would just encourage and ask for your comment on the importance of impact assessments, especially if there is perceived to be a need for some new standards in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Francis. This was an all-encompassing question. So this is very much an area where it's related to the work that we are currently doing around the impact of fintech. I don't know whether Hiro wants to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the concern or the interest that the insurance industry has is that there are many fintech startups which gets into the business of insurance and which does not cover the whole spectrum of the insurance business, but only one part of insurance business, and how to deal with those kind of the new entrants. Another issue would be that there are big service providers like GAFAs and using their big data gathering power, they can provide new types of the financial services, including the financial insurance products, and how to deal with those kind of the big data players. I think there is no quick, of course, answer, but maybe one way to deal with it is that we should analyze the implications and impacts of those new entrants coming into the insurance businesses, and think how to regulate those, those new entrants, which does only one part of whole insurance value chain. So what I'm saying that the well, it is not an immediate thing, but we should maybe think about the more activity-based regulation than the entity-based regulation. And this activity-based means something different from the currently we are discussing in the holistic framework approach, but rather, decomposing the industry insurance value chains and the disbundling and rebundling of certain activities, and think what kind of the regulations or requirements that we insurance supervisors can provide.
Yeah, thank you, Hiro. This is a very sort of challenging field. The regulatory perimeter might not be at the right point in the cycle. And this is a challenging question. A number of our members are actually asking. As Hiro says, our approach to that within the IIS, we're not embarking to an activities-based approach across the value chain of regulation. It's too soon to do that. But this is it is a possibility, a possible response, depending on the developments of unbundling and rebundling that are coming through. So our approach at the moment is to analyze and do surveillance on the issue and identify the current and emerging issues and see whether they need a response or whether it is too soon yet to conclude that there is a need to shift, if you want, the regulatory perimeter to other participants or to completely change model. But this is something that is very much on the radar, as it is on the radar of many, many of our members, precisely as Hiroshi said. Your second question is on market fragmentation. I mean, this is a priority area, as you know, of the Financial Stability Board. So the short answer to your question is that as members of the Financial Stability Board, we are participating in the work that it's been done. I mean, it was discussed at the G20 meetings there. This is a cross-sectoral issue. It's not, it is an issue that, for example, that we hear from the insurance side, mainly with respect to protectionist barriers that have been raised, particularly in the reinsurance industry. But it's not as acute as you hear it in some of the other sectors where more ring fencing of activities than they were done before is taking place. But we are mainly undertaking our market fragmentation work through the FSB channel rather than doing work separately.
Great. Perhaps I can also call on Steve Brody from APCIA.
Thank you very much to all of the ExCo members. Steve Brody from the American Property Casualty Insurance Association. We had submitted a question, kind of a long one, on the ICS, and a lot of what was in the question has been discussed and answered during the excellent panel that we had this morning, and also with the slide presentation that the Secretariat developed. So I'd just like to sort of respond and ask further questions based on that, if I could. First of all, we appreciate the recognition that the monitoring period is for the assessment and monitoring of ICS 2.0 and not for the monitoring of individual insurance group solvency. We also appreciated the statement that it is not intended for reliance by third party. We would definitely endorse the suggestion that Olaf Jones made, that it really should not be intended for third party use at all. And also the clarification that when the final ICS is considered for adoption as a PCR at the end of the monitoring period, that it will be subject to another public exposure. We appreciate that very much. As you may have guessed, though, there's a but here. And we are concerned, as others expressed this morning, that with the significant number of changes that we feel are necessary in the MAV version of the ICS, that it's not ready for a monitoring period at this point. We don't believe that it will be ready for the monitoring period by November. We would like to ask if you can give some greater clarity on how the issues that arise during the monitoring period will be assessed. You mentioned that it will be, will be considered whether there are fatal flaws, whether there are unintended consequences, other reasons why changes might be made. We'd like a little greater clarity on how that's going to be assessed, how decisions will be made, whether to change or not to change the ICS, and also what the opportunities will be for stakeholder input in that process. Also, with regard to the discussion of comparability of the aggregation method being developed in the U.S., you mentioned that there is a project plan that if I remember correctly, the consideration of criteria for assessment of comparable outcomes are starting to be considered, but there was no indication of when the decision would be made with regard to those criteria or anything else with regard to the project plan, except that a decision would be made at the end of the monitoring period. So we would similarly like to know what provisions for stakeholder input will there be on these decisions. Do you have an idea of when the decisions on criteria will be made? And we think that those are fundamentally important decisions on which we would like to have input. So we'd appreciate your response to those questions. And thank you again for this change in format. It seems to be working well, and for all of your consideration.
Thank you, and thank you for the feedback on the change of format. But as I mentioned earlier, we really want to make it interactive. So if you have suggestions for next year, let us know. A number of questions here, very specific and clear questions. Elise, would you like to start us off?
Sure, and thank you for the question. Well, first, I guess the first thing to say is that we're very committed to continue our engagement with stakeholders in the same manner that we have, same frequency that we have up to this point. So we expect that to continue throughout the monitoring period. The other thing is you asked about changes and who will decide and how it will be decided. I expect that the IS will, on an annual basis, assess what, if any, changes might be made to the specifications, what additional data may be requested. I expect that would go through a similar process to how we make decisions now, which is it moves through the PDC, it moves up to our executive committee. As far as, I'm not sure I captured all your questions. You did ask a question about aggregation and comparability, and And so, we've really just begun our discussions in terms of an outline of a timeline. We'll have more to share with you on that at a future time. But I would say that, one of the sort of very first steps that we have to do is define what we mean by comparable outcomes. And so, we've begun these discussions, and as I said, there'll be more to come on that. So I don't know if Vicky, if you would like to add.
Thank you, Elise. I don't know whether colleagues that Mike or Frederick want to add to that.
Sure, happy to jump in. And again, very good questions, Steve, and appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion here. And you've clearly hit on a couple of issues that are quite important, particularly for some of us. Not surprisingly, the U.S. is very focused on these issues. And I think we had a very good, candid, and open discussion at an IAS ExCo level over the course of the last few days that, certainly, hopefully has provided a little bit more clarity, particularly on the issues around the monitoring period. And there, candidly, there is still, we don't know. We're still waiting for the results of the final round of field testing. And then going into the monitoring period, I think we had to be kind of somewhat open-ended in the intentional language we used on the nature and the extent of the changes, because, again, we don't know how significant or insignificant they might be. But I think that the benefit of a body such as this is, at the end of the day, it's comprised of, I think, fairly practical regulators, and to the extent changes need to be addressed, they will be. I think we still have to work through the mechanisms about the timing of those and how they will play out. But we are all committed to ensuring that, at the end of this process, we have a product that is relevant and useful to the global regulatory community. And I think it's fair to say we know we still have a road ahead of us, and what we've accomplished really over the last week gives us a little bit of a roadmap, at least in the initial next couple steps. On aggregation, I think, as Elise has mentioned, we still are, again, have, I think, some more detail that needs to be worked out around the timing and development of comparability criteria. I think it's fair to say that, at least from a U.S. perspective, the more clarity that we have going into the monitoring period, the better for us, so that we can develop our approach in a way that addresses concerns and ultimately expectations around how comparability will work. And again, the overall design here is admittedly somewhat challenging. Comparability or aggregation is a somewhat different language than the ICS reference method. We recognize that. So comparability in some respects is going to need to not only be able to demonstrate the same level of comparable outcomes, but in some sense to provide a Rosetta Stone of sorts so that we can fairly translate between the ICS and the aggregation method. And if we're able to accomplish that and demonstrate that to our colleagues, then I think we'll be in a good place. But we have to still put all of that on the table. And I think where we are in the year, still with 6 months left, we still can accomplish a lot more in the way of that detail by the end of the year, and we certainly are committed to continuing to use the time wisely to do that.
Thank you. I have little to add at this stage, since a lot has already been said. Just maybe regarding the first question, as it was already mentioned this morning, the ICS during the monitoring period is intended to be stable, because it's important to look at how it will behave throughout the economic cycle. That's something important. This does not mean that in case unintended consequences or flaws are identified, they will not be corrected, and this will likely follow the normal governance process of the IIIS. And regarding how significant the changes could be between ICS 2.0 what could be endorsed at the end of the monitoring period as a PCR. As it was already mentioned, that's a question that we cannot answer now. It's the very purpose of the process that we put in place for the monitoring period to really be able to answer this question.
Exactly. I can just, I don't want to repeat these messages. They represent exactly the discussion we've been having. I don't know whether David, who is also very closely involved with this work since he joined us, wants to add any.
Actually, no. I think you summed it up. I would just simply be repeating things that Elise and Mike and Frederic said. They are important questions, Steve. Thank you for raising those. And I think everybody up here and in the front row are working very hard towards the end of the year and the meeting in November to get a project out there. But to your point, Vicky, I don't want to repeat anything except to say that I agree with the comments that were previously made.
Thank you. And just to say that you are going to get more clarity on the detail of how the monitoring process works, how we will get input on the supervisory colleges, how the supervisory colleges are going to discuss the ICS in a way that monitors the ICS and not the companies, and so on, also during November. But also later on in the process, we are going to provide you with much more detail, including on timelines.
Great, so let's open it up for any more questions.
Christian Pirati from the French market. Maybe I want to share with you some concerns that we have in our market. Just maybe one word on our market. Our federation, we represent roughly 260 companies, while we have, I believe, one of the highest number of AIGs, at least in Europe. We have 8 AIGs, international active groups, operating in our market. If you look at deeper in our market, companies originate from France, plus other operators, other AIGs operating in the French market. We come over 70% of market share in the French market. So we believe that the impact on ICS is a major on our market. In this respect, we believe that the ICS should be applied in a consistent way to all at the same time, as agreed in the Kuala Lumpur Agreement. This is really key for us. We believe there, and I will limit it, since this morning we spoke about the level or unlevel playing field. This is key for us, and we believe that there are 3 really critical points before entering the monitoring period. It's first of all international active groups should participate in the exercise. Secondly, the reporting should be based on market-adjusted valuation, and supervisory colleges should exist for every group participating in the exercise. Let me maybe say a last remark when it comes really at one point to an implementation of a global standard. And it was discussed, it should be exposed afterwards and all. But a global standard makes only sense if it's applied by everyone, or nearly everyone. So I think in this respect, special care should be given really to an exercise afterwards to make sure that, let me be blunt, either all or no one should apply it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know, Elise, do you want to start us off on that one as well?
I'm not so sure there was a question there, but in terms of all IIGs participating, I mean, it's our expectation that all IIGs will participate. It's ultimately up to the group-wide supervisor to identify the IAIGs, and the IAS, in terms of its implementation of ComFrame, is taking steps already to identify IIGs. In terms of supervisory colleges, this is another area of our focus on implementation. So for 2019, it's identification of IAIGs and the supervisory cooperation and coordination. In the early years of implementation of ComFrame, we'll focus more on sort of developing materials and organizing training for supervisors and workshops for supervisors. And of course, in the later years, we're going to, develop a robust assessment process for implementation. So, I mean, those are the efforts that I would say would speak to your comment.
Any other interventions on this? Yeah, I mean, essentially, we're expecting all internationally active insurance groups to implement ComFrame, including participate in the monitoring period for ICS version 2.0, and ultimately implement ICS that comes out of the monitoring period in 2025 as a PCR. And we have in process a set of monitoring exercises from our side to ensure that our supervisors to monitor the different jurisdictions that do have internationally active insurance groups and that they have identified them, because it's their it's the supervisor that identifies the internationally active insurance group. It's not the IIS. This is very important. The IIS has certain criteria, but it is the supervisor that identifies the internationally active insurance group. And to ensure that ComFrame and ICS version 2.0 are implemented as the IIS members have committed to do so.
Great. Michelle.
Good afternoon, Michelle Rogers with the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. And my question kind of starts with the stakeholder meeting held in the U.S. In April, where we were discussing with Paolo and others the open issues, the remaining open issues that are involved in the ICS at this time. And there seem to be a number of them, and stakeholders raised several more that remain open. Today, the emphasis is on stability of the 5-year monitoring period and maintaining this ICS formula that it has multiple open issues for a 5-year monitoring period. And I'm wondering why stability of an incomplete process and an incomplete formula will not just end up being a waste of effort for the IAIS. When they have 5 years, they could be improving and resolving issues. Unless you anticipate that there will be some resolution of multiple issues prior to November, I think it just raises the question of whether or not it makes sense to continue calling it a monitoring period or resolving to move forward with field testing.
Thank you, Michelle. Frederick, would you like to take that?
Well, I believe that, of course, the one priority is to be able to solve the pending issues, and the last field test of this year will be extremely instrumental in, settling the pending issues, and it's very important that we have this process in order to be able to sign off in November an ICS 2.0 that we will consider fit for purpose to enter into the new stage which is the monitoring period. So for sure, this is a very important part of the process. It's too early to discuss the substance because it will be fed by the outcome of the field test, but for sure that's a key priority. But then what is also important is that if we have discomfort to enter into the monitoring period, and that's very important, then we consider that the ICS will be intended to be stable throughout the monitoring period, because again, it will be very important that the assessment of the ICS before it becomes a PCR is fed by different components, including the feedback from the supervisors, being the group-wide supervisors, but also the other supervisors that will participate in the college, and that we also have a look about how the ICS behaves throughout a sufficient period of time, and 5 years is quite a substantial period of time, to see how it behaves throughout an economic cycle. And I think that's extremely important. If there are changes every year, we will miss this very important feedback that is really needed to assess the reliability of the ICS, which of course does not preclude, as it was already mentioned, that if there are fatal flaws, they are corrected. But I mean, it's important that we get also this stability to be able to be in the next stage, which is no longer a development stage as it is the case today, but really the monitoring period itself, which is deemed to achieve a different purpose, a different stage in the overall process.
Thanks, Michelle, for the question. I see John Huff. We both like to quote the former American fighter Mike Tyson, who had an expression that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think the point of that is you have to have some intention and a plan for going into the monitoring period. And we were very careful in choosing the words around the current communication plan, that it is the intention of the monitoring period to provide a period of stability. Of course, if there are significant developments, even before we enter the monitoring period as a result of the field testing results, or we see those fatal flaws or unintended consequences or the other things that we have identified in the communication plan, then of course that will cause us to reevaluate the ICS and our plan. So I think with any strategic plan, even planning around the ICS, there is a need to be flexible and adaptable to changes in circumstances. And again, I think you have seen a communication that evidences that openness to adaptation and change should we see it. And as Frederic has mentioned, we don't know yet if those changes will be minor, major. We don't know the outcome of the field testing. But we do have a plan, but we're also prepared to get punched in the face and change it if necessary.
Exactly.
Yes. No punching yet. We prefer robust debate. Good.
Yes.
Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question. It's Dennis Snow from Hanover Reinsurance. A lot of European insurance companies...
Sorry, here we go. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, again?
Oh,
okay.
sorry,
yes.
I missed that.
It's Dennis Snow from Hanover Reinsurance Company. I would like to ask you, a lot of European insurance companies invested in internal models, which is also consideration for allowing ICS. What would be needed to internal models to be allowed, and how could the insurance companies support you in that?
Thank you. Elise, do you want to take that?
Well, so as you know, internal models is one of the sort of additional reporting that's permitted during the monitoring period at the option of the group-wide supervisor. I know also that the field testing specs have been collecting internal model information for several field testing rounds already. I think, IS has said that, that internal models is a viable option, and that they would try to be that they would be in a position by the end of the monitoring period to determine whether they would also be part of the ICS. We're still working and considering, quite frankly, what will be needed for the IS to make that determination, whether it be internal models, GAP Plus, or any other method of determining the capital requirement. So this is still to be worked out during the monitoring period.
But this is an issue, you asked how you can help us on this. This is an issue that, at the moment, to be frank, our priorities in the areas of ICS is to finalize the reference ICS for the monitoring period, to have a very, very clear project plan and very, very clear start of the work on criteria for outcome, for comparability with the ICS for the aggregation method, and to develop all the details that we need to agree on how the monitoring period is going to work to ensure that we get sufficient information to know what we may need to change. So this is the focus at the moment. Additional reporting on internal models and GAP Plus are as an alternative valuation method, and internal models as an alternative to the standard formula for the calculation of capital requirements are part of this. What, as Elise says, what we need to develop is, which we have not yet done so because we are focusing on all these other issues, is the process through which we then come to a decision on internal models. We will do so, and we will engage very actively, obviously, with all stakeholders, and that is when we do that. This is the time to help us on that. Thank you.
So this has been great. But like all good things, they come to an end, I'm afraid. We do have very important business of a welcome reception to go to as well. So but before we do that, let me hand over to Vicky for perhaps just a few words, a few remarks, closing remarks.
Thank you for your active engagement on this. Thank you to those that pre-submitted a number of questions, and thank you for all the engagement so far. I think, as you have seen, we are trying to talk the walk of being responsive to your concerns and responsive to having as much interaction as we can possibly manage, given the size of the audience. And I genuinely want to hear views about how we can further improve on this. But thank you very, very much, and I hope to see a lot of you at the drinks.